The winter of 1945 was brutal in eastern France. Snow covered the ground, and the cold cut through every layer of clothing the soldiers wore. But on January the 31st, in a small courtyard near the village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, a different kind of cold descended. The kind that freezes the soul. Because on that morning, Private Eddie Slovik became the first and only American soldier since the Civil War to be executed for desertion. And to this day, historians, legal scholars, and military experts debate whether his execution was justice or something far darker. This is his story. Eddie Slovik wasn't born a criminal, though the army would later use his past against him in ways that would seal his fate. He came into the world on February 18, 1920, in Detroit, Michigan, the son of Polish immigrants. His parents, Anna and Joseph, had come to America seeking the promise of a better life, but what they found was the grinding poverty of Detroit's working-class neighborhoods during the Great Depression. Eddie was a small kid, slight of build, with a nervous energy that would follow him throughout his short life. His childhood was marked by petty crime, the kind that poor kids in Detroit fell into when there was no money for food and no hope for the future. At 12 years old, he stole brass from a foundry. It was the first of many arrests that would define his teenage years. Petty theft, breaking and entering, disturbing the peace. Nothing violent, nothing that marked him as dangerous, just a kid trying to survive in a world that had no place for him. By the time he was 17, Eddie had been in and out of reform schools and finally landed in prison. He was paroled in 1942, and something changed. He got a job at Montella Plumbing and Heating in Dearborn. It was honest work, the kind of stability he'd never known. And then he met Antoinette Wisniewski. She was working as a bookkeeper for the same company. And somehow, this woman saw something in Eddie Slovik that the world had missed. They married on November 7th, 1942, and for the first time in his life, Eddie had something worth protecting. His criminal record should have kept him out of the war. The military classified him as 4F, morally unfit for service, but by late 1943, the war machine was hungry for bodies. American forces were preparing for the invasion of Europe, and they needed every man they could get. Eddie's classification was changed to 1A, and on January 3, 1944, he received his draft notice. He was terrified. Eddie Slovik arrived at Camp Walters, Texas, for basic training on January 24, 1944. He was 23 years old, married, and completely unprepared for what the army demanded of him. But he completed his training. He learned to march, to salute, to follow orders. He qualified with his rifle. He did everything the army asked of him during those months of training. Nobody could say he didn't try. In August 1944, Eddie shipped out to France. The Allies had landed in Normandy 2 months earlier, and now they were pushing east toward Germany. Eddie was assigned as a replacement to Company G, 109th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division. He never wanted to be there. He'd told anyone who would listen that he was afraid, that he didn't think he could handle combat. But the army doesn't care about fear. Fear is what you overcome. Fear is what makes you a soldier. Except Eddie Slovik couldn't overcome it. On August 25, 1944, Eddie and another replacement, Private John Tanky, were making their way to join Company G near the French town of Elbeuf when German artillery opened up. They dove for cover, and in the chaos and confusion of the shelling, they became separated from their unit. Company G moved out the next morning, inadvertently leaving the 2 men behind. Here's where Eddie's story takes its first tragic turn. Instead of immediately trying to find their unit, Eddie and Tanky found a Canadian military police unit that had occupied the town, and they stayed there for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of relative safety while their fellow soldiers fought and died on the front lines. Tanky wrote to their regiment to explain their absence, but neither man made any urgent effort to rejoin the fighting. The Canadians eventually made arrangements to return them to their unit on October 7, 1944. When Eddie arrived back at Company G, he immediately went to his company commander, Captain Ralph Grotta, and he was honest in a way that would destroy him. He told Captain Grotta that he was too scared to serve in a rifle company. He asked to be reassigned to a rear area unit where he wouldn't have to face combat. Then he asked a question that would echo through history. If he ran away, would that be desertion? Would he face a court-martial? Captain Grotta confirmed that, yes, running away would be desertion. Yes, it would result in a court-martial. And then he refused Eddie's request for reassignment and sent him to a rifle platoon. Eddie's friend Tanky would later testify that Eddie's mind was made up. Nothing was going to change it. He was too afraid. The next day, October 9th, 1944, Eddie Slovik deserted. He walked several miles to the rear and approached a military government detachment of the 112th Infantry Regiment. He handed an enlisted cook a handwritten note. The note was a confession. In Eddie's own words, with his misspellings and simple grammar, he admitted to desertion. He explained that he had been too scared to move when the shells started falling. He said that he had stayed in Elbeuf, had stayed with the Canadians, and had now run away again. And then he wrote words that would seal his fate. "And I'll run away again if I have to go out there." The cook took Eddie to a military policeman, who took him to his company commander. The commander read the note and did something extraordinary. He urged Eddie to destroy it. Right then, right there. "Tear it up, go back to your unit, and this never happened." Eddie refused. The note was taken to Lieutenant Colonel Ross Henbest, who offered Eddie the same opportunity. "Destroy the note, return to your unit, face no charges." Eddie refused again. Henbest then did something that should have made Eddie understand the gravity of his situation. He instructed Eddie to write another note on the back of the first one, stating that he fully understood the consequences of deliberately incriminating himself, and that his confession would be used as evidence against him in a court-martial. Eddie wrote it. He signed it. He still believed he would only face jail time. Eddie was confined to the division stockade. The division's judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Summer, made one final attempt to save Eddie from himself. He offered Eddie a third opportunity to rejoin his unit with all charges dropped. He even offered to transfer Eddie to a different infantry regiment where no one would know his past, where he could start with a clean slate. Eddie, convinced that a court-martial would only result in imprisonment, declined. He'd already been to prison. He could handle prison. Prison was better than dying in a foxhole. "I've made up my mind," Eddie told them. "I'll take my court-martial." What Eddie didn't understand, what nobody fully explained to him, was the context. The 28th Infantry Division was about to launch an attack in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest, most brutal campaigns of the entire war. The forest was a green hell where American advantages in armor and air support meant nothing. German defenses were ferocious. Casualties were astronomical, and morale was cracking. Desertion was becoming a problem. Not a massive problem. Less than half of 1% of soldiers were indicating they'd rather be imprisoned than face combat, but the rates were rising. The army needed to send a message, and Eddie Slovik, with his criminal record and his signed confession, was the perfect scapegoat. Eddie's court-martial took place on November 11th, 1944. Armistice Day, ironically enough. The day the previous generation had celebrated the end of the First World War. Eddie had to be tried by officers from other divisions, because every combat officer from the 28th Infantry was fighting on the front lines. 9 staff officers sat in judgment of a terrified private who had never fired a shot in anger. The prosecution, led by Captain John Green, presented witnesses who testified that Eddie had stated his intention to run away. Eddie's defense counsel, Captain Edward Woods, later said that Eddie had elected not to testify on his own behalf, though the reasons why remain unclear. Perhaps Woods thought Eddie's nervousness would hurt his case. Perhaps Eddie was simply too afraid to speak. The trial lasted a single day. By the end of it, all 9 officers found Eddie Slovik guilty and sentenced him to death by firing squad. Major General Norman Cota, the division commander, reviewed and approved the sentence. Cota was a hard man, a soldier's soldier who had led troops onto Omaha Beach on D-Day. He later explained his reasoning. Given the situation as I knew it in November 1944, I thought it was my duty to this country to approve that sentence. If I hadn't approved it, if I had let Slovik accomplish his purpose, I don't know how I could have gone up to the line and looked a good soldier in the face. But here's what makes this case so troubling. What makes historians and legal experts call it an injustice. During World War II, over 21,000 American servicemen received varying sentences for desertion. 49 were sentenced to death. 48 of those sentences were commuted. Eddie Slovik was the only one who was actually executed. The only one. On December 9th, Eddie wrote a letter to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, pleading for clemency. But timing is everything in history, and Eddie's timing was catastrophic. On December 16th, just a week after Eddie's letter, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. American casualties were severe. Morale was at its lowest point of the entire war, and desertion rates were climbing. The case was reviewed by the Army's legal staff. Assistant Staff Judge Advocate Major Frederick Bertolet wrote a recommendation against clemency. He argued that Eddie had deliberately sought confinement to avoid combat, that he had directly challenged the authority of the government, and that future discipline depended on a resolute reply to this challenge. He wrote, "If the death penalty is ever to be applied to desertion, it should be imposed in this case, not as a punitive measure or retribution, but to maintain that discipline upon which an army can succeed against the enemy." Brigadier General E.C. McNeill, the senior Army lawyer in the European theatre, reviewed the case and wrote, "This is the first death sentence which has reached me for examination. It is probably the first of the kind in the American Army for over 80 years. There were none in World War I. In this case, the extreme penalty of death appears warranted." Lieutenant Colonel Henry Summer, the same man who had offered Eddie a final chance to have his charges dismissed, wrote, "The death sentence is deemed appropriate in this case. The accused is a habitual criminal." That phrase, habitual criminal, appears again and again in the reviews of Eddie's case. His teenage petty thefts, his time in reform school, his criminal record, it all became evidence that he wasn't worthy of mercy. Never mind that he'd been living an honest life for 2 years before the war. Never mind that he'd completed basic training and had done everything asked of him up until the moment real combat loomed. His past condemned him. General Eisenhower confirmed the execution order on December 23, 1944. The sentence came as a complete shock to Eddie. He had been expecting a dishonorable discharge and a prison term. That's what he'd seen happen to other deserters from his division while he was in the stockade. He'd seen men refuse to fight, men who were given a few years in military prison and then expected to be released when the war ended. Eddie had calculated that he could survive a few years in prison, that he'd get out and go back to Antoinette and rebuild his life. He never imagined they would actually kill him. The execution was scheduled for January 31st, 1945, near the village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines in eastern France. Eddie had nearly 2 months to think about what was coming. 2 months to write letters to Antoinette, to try to explain, to say goodbye. 2 months to wake up every morning knowing that today might be the day. 2 months of that particular torture. On the morning of January 31st, they came for him. Eddie was 24 years old. He'd been married for 2 years and 2 months. He was a private in the United States Army who had never fired a shot in combat. And they were going to kill him. As the soldiers prepared him for the firing squad, stripping his uniform of all insignia as military custom required, Eddie spoke. His words were defiant, but underneath the defiance was a simple truth. They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. Thousands of guys have done that. They just need to make an example out of somebody, and I'm it because I'm an ex-con. I used to steal things when I was a kid, and that's what they're shooting me for. They're shooting me for the bread and chewing gum I stole when I was 12 years old. They wrapped him in a GI blanket to protect him from the cold. The cold. They were going to shoot him in the heart in a few minutes, but they wrapped him in a blanket so he wouldn't be cold. The absurdity of war, the bureaucratic machinery of death, it all continued according to procedure. They led him to a courtyard with a high masonry wall that would deflect errant bullets and shield the local French civilians from witnessing the execution. They strapped him to a post with web belts, one under his arms, and hung on a spike to keep his body from slumping after the volley. Others secured his waist and knees. The attending chaplain, Father Carl Patrick Cummings, tried to offer comfort. He said to Eddie, "Eddie, when you get up there, say a little prayer for me." Eddie Slovik's last words were, "Okay, Father. I'll pray that you don't follow me too soon." The firing squad consisted of 12 soldiers from the 109th Regiment. 11 rifles were loaded with a single round. 1 rifle was loaded with a blank, so that each man could tell himself that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't killed Eddie Slovik. They placed a black hood over Eddie's head. On the command of fire, 11 bullets struck him. The wounds ranged from high in the neck region out to the left shoulder, over the left chest, and under the heart. 1 bullet was in the left upper arm. An army physician quickly determined that Eddie had not been killed instantly. As the firing squad's rifles were being reloaded to fire another volley, Eddie died. The entire execution took 15 minutes. It was 10:04 a.m. Eddie Slovik was buried in Plot E of the Oise-Aisne American Cemetery in France, alongside 95 other American soldiers who had been executed for crimes like rape or murder. Their grave markers were hidden from view by shrubbery and bore sequential numbers instead of names. Even in death, even after paying the ultimate price, Eddie Slovik was considered too shameful to be named. Antoinette Slovik spent the rest of her life fighting to clear her husband's name. She petitioned 7 presidents: Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, for a pardon. None was granted. She died in 1979, 34 years after watching her husband march off to war, never achieving the justice she sought. It wasn't until 1987 that Eddie's remains were finally returned to the United States and reburied in Detroit's Woodmere Cemetery next to Antoinette. Bernard Kalka, a Polish-American veteran and former Macomb County Commissioner, had persuaded President Ronald Reagan to order their return. But still, no pardon. No acknowledgement that perhaps the army had gotten this one wrong. So what makes Eddie Slovik's execution an injustice? Let's look at the facts. During World War II, the United States military held 1.7 million courts-martial. A clemency board appointed by Secretary of War Henry Stimson reviewed 27,000 serious cases and remitted or reduced sentences in 85% of them. The death penalty was rarely imposed, and when it was usually for rape or murder. Eddie Slovik was convicted of a purely military offense. He never harmed another person. He never fired a weapon in anger. He simply couldn't face combat. And he was honest about it. That's the cruel irony. If Eddie had simply disappeared into the chaos of war, if he'd gone AWOL without leaving a written confession, if he'd made up a story about being wounded or lost, he might have faced a few years in prison or even gotten away with it entirely. Thousands of American soldiers deserted during World War II. The vast majority were never caught. Of those who were caught, the vast majority received prison sentences that were later commuted. Eddie's honesty, his naive belief that the army would treat him fairly if he just told the truth, condemned him. Colonel Robert Bard of the Judge Advocate General's office later noted that of the 2,864 Army personnel tried for desertion between January 1942 and June 1948, 49 were sentenced to death, and 48 of those sentences were commuted. At least one member of the court-martial board came to believe that Eddie's execution was an injustice, an example of disparate treatment from a flawed process. The timing was wrong. If Eddie had been tried before the Battle of the Bulge, his sentence might have been commuted like all the others. If he'd been tried after the war, when the need for harsh examples had passed, he would have faced a few years in prison at most. But he was tried in the middle of the worst American crisis of the European War, when Eisenhower and the military leadership felt they needed to send a message about discipline and obedience. His background was wrong. Eddie's criminal record, his teenage mistakes, the petty thefts born of poverty and desperation, they all became evidence that he was fundamentally unworthy of mercy. The phrase habitual criminal appeared in legal review after legal review, as if stealing brass at age 12 meant he deserved to die at age 24. And perhaps most damning of all, he was in the wrong unit at the wrong time. The 28th Infantry Division was about to enter hell in the Hurtgen Forest. Morale was fragile. Desertion rates were rising. The army needed a scapegoat, someone to make an example of, someone whose death would terrify other soldiers into staying in line. Eddie Slovik was that someone. But here's what haunts anyone who studies this case. Eddie never got the chance to be brave. He never got the chance to discover whether he could overcome his fear. He spent 6 weeks with the Canadians, then a few days with his unit, before deserting. He never faced a single battle. He never had the opportunity to find out if, when bullets started flying and his buddies needed him, something in him would have risen to the occasion. Countless soldiers have talked about being terrified before their first combat, then discovering reserves of courage they never knew they had. Eddie never got that chance. The question that historians continue to debate is this: was Eddie Slovik a coward who got what he deserved, or was he a scared kid who was failed by a system that needed a sacrifice? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Eddie deserted. That's not in dispute. He refused multiple opportunities to return to his unit and face no charges. That's also not in dispute. But was he so fundamentally different from the 48 other men whose death sentences were commuted? Was he so much worse than the thousands of other deserters who faced prison time? Or was he just unlucky, caught at the wrong moment in history by an army that needed to prove a point? Consider this: the last American soldier executed for desertion before Eddie Slovik had been shot during the Civil War, 80 years earlier. In World War I, despite massive desertions, the United States executed 35 soldiers, but all for crimes like rape or murder of civilians, not for military offenses. The United States was almost unique among major combatants in its restraint. The British executed over 300 soldiers during World War I. The French executed hundreds. The Germans executed thousands. But America had moved away from executing soldiers for purely military offenses. Until Eddie Slovik. And then, after Eddie, never again. In the Korean War, in Vietnam, in every conflict since, American soldiers have deserted. Some have faced prison time. Some have received dishonorable discharges. But none have been executed. Eddie Slovik remains the last. That fact alone should tell us something. If the military has managed to maintain discipline for the past 80 years without executing soldiers for desertion, was it truly necessary in Eddie's case? Or was his execution a moment of panic, a leadership failure, a decision made in the heat of crisis that everyone later regretted but no one would reverse? The people who reviewed Eddie's case after the war saw the injustice. The Clemency Board that reviewed 27,000 cases commuted sentences in 85% of them. They understood that men break under pressure, that fear is human, that punishment should be proportional and fair. But Eddie's case never got a post-war review because he was already dead. Antoinette understood. She spent 34 years fighting for her husband's memory, trying to get someone, anyone, to acknowledge that what happened to Eddie was wrong. She never succeeded. 7 presidents heard her plea, and 7 presidents turned her away. The message was clear. Eddie Slovik had been tried, convicted, and executed according to military law. The system had worked as designed. There would be no pardon, no acknowledgement of error, no justice. But here's what the military couldn't take from Eddie, couldn't erase with their execution or their unmarked grave or their decades of refusing to grant a pardon. His story. William Bradford Howe published a book about Eddie in 1954, The Execution of Private Slovik, that brought national attention to the case. Frank Sinatra tried to make a movie about it in 1960, but was forced to cancel the project due to political pressure. In 1974, a TV movie starring Martin Sheen finally told Eddie's story to a national audience. Kurt Vonnegut mentioned him in Slaughterhouse-Five. Eddie Slovik became more than a deserter. He became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when fear meets bureaucracy, when human frailty meets institutional inflexibility, when a person's past mistakes are allowed to determine their future worth. He became a reminder that the American military, for all its power and might, is capable of profound injustice. Think about the 12 men who made up that firing squad. They were soldiers from Eddie's own regiment, the 109th. They might have known him. They might have talked to him, shared rations with him, heard his story. And then they were ordered to kill him. One of them got the blank round, so each man could tell himself he might not have fired a killing shot. But 11 of them knew. They lived with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Did they think justice had been served? Or did they lie awake at night, wondering why Eddie Slovik had to die when thousands of other deserters went to prison and came home? Think about the officers who offered Eddie multiple chances to tear up his confession, to return to his unit, to avoid the entire nightmare. They saw what was coming. They understood that the wheels of military justice, once set in motion, would crush this scared private with his criminal record and his signed confession. They tried to save him from himself, and he refused. Did that make them feel better when they heard he'd been executed? Or did they wonder if they should have done more, insisted more forcefully, made Eddie understand what was truly at stake? Think about General Cota, who approved the death sentence. He was a genuine war hero, a man who had led troops under fire, who understood courage and cowardice as well as anyone. He said he approved the sentence because he had to maintain discipline, because he couldn't look good soldiers in the face if he let Eddie accomplish his purpose of avoiding combat through desertion. But did he ever wonder, in quiet moments, if executing one terrified private had actually accomplished anything? Did desertion rates go down? Did morale improve? Or did it just create a cautionary tale that made soldiers even more afraid, not of the enemy, but of their own army? And think about Eisenhower, who confirmed the execution order. He was the supreme Allied commander, responsible for millions of men, for the entire European campaign. He had to make impossible decisions every day, decisions that sent thousands to their deaths. One more death, one deserter who had confessed and refused multiple opportunities to return to duty. It must have seemed like a simple case. The legal reviews all recommended execution. The battlefield situation demanded harsh discipline. But Eisenhower lived until 1969, 24 years after Eddie's execution. Did he ever reconsider? Did he ever think that maybe, just maybe, that decision should have been different? We'll never know, because none of them ever publicly questioned the decision. The military closed ranks. The execution was legal, it was proper, it was necessary. End of discussion. Except the discussion never really ended, because Eddie Slovik's story asks questions that every generation needs to answer. How do we treat people who are afraid? How do we judge someone's worst moment? How do we balance the needs of discipline and order with the reality of human weakness? And perhaps most importantly, how much should a person's past mistakes determine their future fate? Eddie stole as a child because he was poor and hungry. He committed petty crimes as a teenager because he had no guidance and no opportunities. He went to prison, served his time, got out, and turned his life around. He got a job, married a woman who loved him, tried to build a decent life. And then the war came and took him away from all of that, threw him into a situation he couldn't handle. And when he was honest about his fear, when he refused to pretend to be brave, the army killed him for it. Was that justice? Or was it expediency dressed up as discipline? The army's own actions in the decades since suggest they know the answer. They've never executed another soldier for desertion. They've maintained discipline through other means: prison sentences, dishonorable discharges, loss of benefits. They've recognized that killing scared soldiers doesn't make armies stronger. If anything, it makes them weaker, because it teaches soldiers that the army cares more about obedience than humanity, more about appearances than reality. Eddie Slovik died alone on a cold morning in France, strapped to a post, shot by his fellow soldiers, for the crime of being too honest about his fear. He died believing he was being executed for stealing bread and chewing gum when he was 12. And maybe, in a way, he was right. Maybe it wasn't really about desertion at all. Maybe it was about class, about being from the wrong side of Detroit, about having a criminal record, about being expendable in a way that other deserters weren't. The 48 other men whose death sentences were commuted, were they from better families? Did they have cleaner records? Were they just luckier in their timing? We don't know, because their cases aren't as well documented, because they survived and went home and tried to forget. Only Eddie's case remains, preserved in painful detail, a permanent record of American military justice at its most questionable. If there's any hope to be found in this story, it's that we've learned from it. The military hasn't repeated Eddie's execution. Presidents may have refused to pardon him, but they've also ensured that no other soldier would face the firing squad for desertion. The balance between discipline and humanity has shifted, slowly, imperfectly, but definitively. Eddie's death might not have been necessary, but it wasn't entirely meaningless if it helped create a military that treats its frightened soldiers with more compassion. But that's cold comfort to Antoinette, who died without seeing her husband pardoned. Cold comfort to Eddie, who died at 24 for being afraid. Cold comfort to everyone who looks at this case and sees not justice, but tragedy. On January the 31st, 1945, at 10:04 a.m., Private Eddie Slovik died. The official cause of death was execution by firing squad for the military offense of desertion. But the real cause was more complicated. He died of bad timing, bad luck, bad circumstances, and a military system that needed a sacrifice and chose him. He died because 48 other men got mercy, and he got a bullet. He died because he was honest when he should have been clever, because he was poor when he should have been privileged, because he was afraid when he was supposed to be brave. He died, and the army called it justice. But history calls it something else. History calls it a tragedy, a mistake, an injustice that should never have happened and must never happen again. Eddie Slovik was the first American soldier since the Civil War to be executed for desertion. He remains the last, and perhaps the greatest tribute we can pay to his memory is to ensure that he stays the last, that no other frightened soldier ever faces a firing squad for being too honest about their fear. That won't bring Eddie back. It won't give Antoinette the pardon she fought for. It won't erase the injustice. But it might, just might, mean that Eddie's death taught us something about mercy, about humanity, about the difference between discipline and cruelty. In the end, Eddie Slovik's story isn't really about desertion. It's about how we treat the weakest among us when the stakes are highest. It's about whether justice means the same thing for everyone, or whether it depends on your background, your timing, your luck. It's about the price of fear in a world that demands courage. And it's about the permanent stain left on American military history by a decision that can never be undone, but should never be forgotten. Eddie Slovik was 24 years old. He was married. He was afraid. And for that, America killed him. History will judge whether that was justice or something far worse.